and my favorite album on the Reprise Records label. Sorry, the Relapse. A little bit of a cock up there. But my number... What the fuck? Fucking... Whoop. We still on?
I think we are.
Yeah, fucking... Sorry, update notification on my phone. I thought it stopped recording. But I'll have to put a jump cut at that fucking part there. But anyways, what is up, guys? The Strong Boys 19 here, and we are finally here to do a list of our favorite albums of this year of 2021. And by the way, thank you all very much with your patience of not doing this list a few weeks earlier because I've been very busy, but I am finally here to do this list, and with a special guest that you may have seen before through an episode of Classic Albums Revisited, where we've reviewed System of a Down's Toxicity. And I have with me Jake from SeditionThroughScorns. So how's it going, buddy?
It's going pretty well. How are you doing today? And first off, it's an absolute honor to do a 2020 album review list. And hopefully everyone will like my list. If not, well, we'll see what happens. But it's an absolute honor to be doing another collaborative review. This is my third collaborative review with you this year, so it's pretty fucking cool. I'm so stoked to do this.
Excellent. So the way we're going to do this, guys, is that we are first off going to be going through a few honorable mentions, and we are going to then move into our top 15 favorite albums of this year. And bear in mind, guys, just like what I've done on my video on the disappointments / worst albums of the year, that this is basically all an opinion. And if you have a list of your own, please address your list in the comments down below, as me and Jake are going to be very curious to see which albums were your favorites from this year. So I will start onto the honorable mentions first off. I have personally got, like, I guess a top 5, but this direction of the list is in no particular order. Some of the picks may shock or surprise people, but at the end of the day, it is what it is with our lists. So these albums that are in my honorable mentions obviously are not bad albums. They are very good for what they are, but they just didn't quite make it into the list. Yet alone, these are albums that I did review for the channel. Besides that, I've listened to a ton of the others that I did not review. Right, so first honorable mention album for me is Between the Buried and Me with Colors 2. Now, this album was the very first Between the Buried and Me album that I've bought on CD. However, having said that, I did listen to Colors 1 prior to the release of this. It is a very lengthy album, but don't get me wrong, the production, the musicianship, and as well as a lot of the songwriting, the complexity, the virtuoso skillful playing from these guys, all absolutely amazing on this record. But it has to be at a very digestible approach because there's a lot of stuff going on this album. But nonetheless, this is a very, very good album from the band. And the next one, from one of the household names of black metal, Dark Throne with Eternal Hails. Excellent album. Few nitpicks I have with this, but being the follow-up to Old Star, I really enjoy a lot of this album. Some really typical, murky, very lo-fi quality sounding black metal from the duo, but you know, what could you really expect from one of the most influential masters of the genre? So that is Eternal Hails from Dark Throne. The next album that I don't have on physical media yet, I will have to give a shout out to Blaze Bayley with his album War Within Me. It's a very, very solid album from the very underrated heavy metal solo artist obviously formerly being the Iron Maiden vocalist in the mid-90s, but War Within Me has a lot of very catchy and memorable songs. Really solid stuff. The next album, I'm going to put in a Bandcamp release of a band called Radarna, with the album the Fomorian Horde, whom one of the band members messaged me on Skype to talk about this new album, and I really enjoy a lot of it. And one of the band members runs a YouTube channel called Narrated Myths and Legends. Very cool guy, and it's been a privilege to talk about the new album from Radarna. So definitely check that out if you haven't. And the last one, this is going to be quite a shocker for some people, from one of my favorite bands of all time, that being Iron Maiden with Sen Jutsu. So, Sen Jutsu, I still stand by my words about this album. There were some flaws on this record, on some tracks, and even on the production. But this album, for me, not as near perfect as the Book of Souls. However, with Sen Jutsu, it is, I would say, still very well worth it for the return for one of heavy metal's most beloved and greatest giants of the genre. Sen Jutsu, very, very, very good album for what it is. Personally, though, I will say, some people may agree or not, that I think that this is one of the other overhyped albums of the year. But having said that, I really enjoy so much of this album, but it's just not enough to really put this in as one of my top 15. So those are my honorable mentions.
There are some pretty good choices there, man. I love the new Between the Buried and Me album, Colors 2. I think it's probably the best album the band has ever done, personally. I think it's even miles better than Colors 1, which, in my opinion, is the band's best album to date. And I feel like Between the Buried and Me have some hit or miss albums in the later half of the career, but Colors 2 is basically just like a reconfiguration of the band's career. And I feel like they are one of the best modern progressive metal bands out there, alongside bands like Tesseract, Oceans of Slumber, Intranauts, and The Ocean. I give a shout out to The Ocean, which is another great band that I find extremely underrated.
Yes, absolutely. The Ocean as well, another amazing prog metal band from Germany.
Absolutely. So my honorable mention list, it might be a little bit surprising as well, too. I actually put 6 honorable mentions, but I'll go dive in quickly because as we're going to 2022, my first honorable mention is by a doom metal band, which not many people know. I'm a huge doom metal fan, preferably the Funeral Doom, Death Doom style of bands. And I'm talking about the band Chemist with the album Deceiver. This was the band's first album under Nuclear Blast Records, and they are a doom metal band based out of Denver, Colorado. And the best way to describe the sound is like picture early Black Sabbath with hints of Electric Wizard, Candlemass, and heavy metal style signature sound of Iron Maiden with a doomy, gloomy, and contemporary style of doom metal. If you're into those type of bands, definitely check this one out. It was my favorite doom metal album of the year. If you're into that, definitely check out Chemist. They are absolutely fantastic. The next honorable mention is by another band that me and Greg are huge fans of, and it might be surprising that I didn't include this on my album of the year list, but it is a great fucking album for what it is. And I'm talking about Gojira with Fortitude. I love Gojira. I've been a huge fan of them since From Mars to Sirius, which is still my favorite album in the band's catalog. I do think this album, stylistically speaking, is a little bit better on the musical aspect compared to Magma, which I know people give that album a lot of flack because of the songwriting and maturity of the record. But Fortitude, to me, is like the band doing what they've done best. There's elements of progressive, groove, thrash, a little bit of death metal tinges here and there, and I feel like Gojira are one of the prime leaders of how to not only be a great modernized metal band, but to stay consistent over the course of the years. And I feel like they just get better with every album as they go on. So Fortitude by Gojira. Next honorable mention, Dark Throne with Eternal Hails. One of Norway's finest bands in the Norwegian black metal scene. Of course, they're iconic for creating the most unholy trinity albums in the history of black metal. A Blaze in the Northern Sky being my personal favorite Dark Throne album, and also Panzerfaust is a close second, which I think that album deserves to be more talked about because of how unadulterated sounding that record is. Eternal Hails is basically a continuation of their last album, All Star, which I thought was a pretty good album for what it was, but there's still some black metal tinges here and there, but they also have elements of heavy metal, speed metal, and also crust punk, which seems to be unordinary for a Dark Throne album, but for a band being around for over 30 plus years in existence, that just comes to show that Nocturnal Uno and Fenris, the masterminds of Dark Throne, have really wanted to create a vision that was so stylistically progressive and appealing and chaotic at times. I just feel like this album is just so fucking good. I mean, it's really good. The next honorable mention is by a death metal band who are, in my opinion, probably one of the most over-talked band in the extreme metal community. And of course, I'm talking about the band Sing with Sugabog with the album Tortured Whole. Now, if you don't know Sing with Sugabog, they are a death metal band based out of Ohio, and they've been around for quite some time. And this is their first full-length under Century Media Records. If you are fans of old Mortician, Torture Rack, Cannibal Corpse, if you like that down-tune, greedy, snare tone drumming aesthetic style of death metal with hinges of a little bit of metallic hardcore here and there, I feel like this album is going to be up your alley. They do get a lot of shit because they are formerly known as a meme band where they sell more memes and they have more merchandise than actual music itself. But for a band like them being on Century Media Records, it's such a huge thing for them. So I'm actually really excited for them to be on a roster with Century Media Records and just go with the flow. And of course, death metal has been my favorite genre for many years, as many you can tell that how I'm speaking about. So Sing with Sugabog Torture Hole by Sing with Sugabog, great album, definitely check it out if you're into that. Next honorable mention is another band who I'm a huge fan of, and of course I feel like this album, I might get sacrilegious for this, but I don't really care. This is my list and not yours. One of the greatest extreme metal bands of all time. I feel like this band has not made a bad album, well, except for one, but we don't talk about that. And I'm talking about Carcass with Torn Arteries.
Ooh.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is this on your honorable mention list? Well, it's because I haven't heard this album as many times as I should have, because I was one of those people that was on the hype train when Surgical Steel first came out, which I still think that's one of their best albums in the later half of their career. But Torn Arteries, to me, is just a fine representation of what Carcass has done in the past. They were a gore grind, death grind band. They were basically an Exhumed in Pentagon worship, but over the course of their existence with albums like Heartwork, which in my opinion is my favorite album of Carcass. They transitioned themselves into a melodic death metal band where every sound, love that album. One of my favorite records ever made. But Torn Arteries is the continuation of how they are formerly known and what they can do. They do best. Every song is melodic, it's catchy, groovy at times. There's a little bit of the death grind influences from their earlier albums, like Symphonies of Sickness, for example. But this album is just Carcass doing what Carcass does best. And I feel like Carcass are just no introduction needed. They're legends. They've been around for so many years. And I feel like this album is just one of their best in a very long time. Is it better than Surgical Steel? I can't really say about it, but this is just such a damn good album. And the last honorable mention list is my favorite symphonic metal band which I actually do like some symphonic metal here and there. And I'm talking about the new album from the band Epica with the album titled Omega. I've been a huge Epica fan since 2008. I got to see them live numerous times, even got to meet the band in 2016 when they opened with The Agonist and Flesh God Apocalypse. Amazing show, great lineup. Epica to me are one of those quintessential symphonic metal bands. Like, of course, when you think of symphonic metal, you think of like the greats like Nightwish, After Forever, Serenia, Ultrasthenia, and a whole lot more. But Epica to me have always been delivering some incredible quality records, showcasing the band's most heaviest, most melodic, even like experimental side albums they've ever done created musically. I mean, they do play symphonic metal, but this album has a lot of power metal influences. There's some classical streams. There's some gothic metal tinges here and there, which you can definitely tell in the mix that they're kind of going to that route just a little bit more. Epica are just one of my favorite bands in the symphonic metal genre, and I think this is probably their best album since Design Your Universe, which in my opinion is Epica's best album to date. So those are my honorable mentions.
Some excellent choices, and can't go wrong with Surgical Steel. So, anyways, guys, those are the honorable mentions. So we're going to narrow it down to our top 15 favorite albums of the year. As I said, with our opinions, we're going to whiz through them and share our brief analysis of what we think of these albums. So, my list to start things off. At number 15, from one of my favorite bands in the folk metal genre, if not for me, my personal favorite for a lot of nostalgia reasons, and that is Julha by Korpiklani. So, this is an album released through Nuclear Blast Records, and what I really like so much about this album is the variety. There are some numerous points on some of the tracks where I find some of the riffs to be at a pretty heavy standing point for Korpiklani. The vocals on a ton of these songs, they were melodic, so exciting, and Korpiklani have been going through a bit of variation into this type of direction. It's a pretty lengthy album, but for over an hour's worth of music, I think this is a wonderful, wonderful release from one of my favorite bands. I wouldn't say it's like a very strong record because I am more of a fan of Korpiklani from pretty much from the mid to late 2000s era, but with this amount of diversity and performances, this is just as a very fun and energetic way that Korpiklani cannot really go anywhere wrong with. So that is Julha by Korpiklani at number 15.
You know, it's funny that you say that is because I haven't really been the biggest Korpiklani fan. Like, I love their earlier works, especially their album Tales Along the Road, which I think came out in 2006, and it had the song Happy Little Bozer, and I was instantly hooked then. But I forgot they made a new album, but I'll definitely have to check it out once the video is done because I do like their stuff. They're very fun, and they're actually really exciting live. If you haven't seen them live, you need to. They're fun. They're really fun.
Excellent. So
okay.
let's take turns. So I've shared my 15 and what is your number 15, and we're going to go each turn all the way from 15 to number 1.
All right. So my 15th favorite album of 2021 is a band that I've been stuck with since middle school. I've been a fan of these guys for a very long time, and I wasn't really sure how I would be able to put it in this eye. Some say I might get sacrilegious for it, but it's really my list. And once again, this is a band that I have been always loved for a very long time, and I feel like this is probably the band's best album in terms of consistency and musical delivery. And my 15th favorite album is by the new Trivium album, In the Court of the Dragon. In my personal opinion, this is miles better than What the Dead Men Say. This album is a lot heavier. It's more stylistic. There's a lot of elements of thrash metal, progressive metal, heavy metal, a little bit of metalcore here and there, which I'll know a lot of people saying that Trivium is a metalcore band. I consider them to be a metal band with thrash metal, prog, and also some heavy metal influences. I mean, you may classify them as a Metallica clone or like Megadeth or Slayer, but I don't really see that resemblance in whatsoever. In the Court of the Dragon, to me, is like what Trivium should stay the course. I feel like this album is basically like Sin of the Sentence era mixed with a little bit of like Shogun and also the Crusade. There's a lot of melodicism, there's some groove elements here and there, and I feel like this is the band's finest hour to date. Like the musicianship, the craftsmanship, the delivery, and Matt Heafy's vocals on this album. I've never felt like he was just so on point and articulated, because in my personal opinion, Matt Heafy is not only an underrated vocalist in today's modern era, but I feel like as each album, as he progresses onward, he knows he's comfortable with his vocals and he knows what the band is utilizing in creating such a unique and foundative album. And I feel like this album is basically Trivium at their peak, especially in the modern day era. I mean, songs like A Crisis of Revelation, the title track, The Shadow of the Abattoir, which in my opinion is the best song on the album. I love the aggressiveness. I love the guitar melodies. The drums are on point. And overall, I think this is probably my favorite Trivium album. And while I do believe Shogun is their best, In the Court of the Dragon might become that number one spot. So number 15, In the Court of the Dragon by Trivium. Fantastic album.
It is another amazing record, and that album is going to be mentioned later on in the list for me. So, yeah, absolutely just a very strong record from one of the best modern metal bands.
I agree.
Okay. My number 14, so from starting folk metal to now go into more on the rock spectrum, from one of my favorite solo artists of all time. Apologies for the buzzing noises on my mobile, guys, because I'm getting Discord notifications. But anyways, from one of my favorite solo artists of all time, a legend from Canada, and I'm going to go very brief with this because I've done a review on this. I'm going to put in Neil Young and Crazy Horse with the album Barn. So even though this is, to me, what I think, it's their rawest sounding album recorded inside a barn, and while there were some moments of some sloppiness on lead playing and a few weaker lyrics, since I've been a massive fan of Neil Young, I think that some of the songs on this album are at one of his best. I think that some of the material on this record do make me reflect onto some of my favorite eras from his discography, like the early to mid 70s. And with this record that still has references about Neil going on a bit of a environmental political side to referencing about his past self, but I think it has an identity where I really attach to this album quite a lot more than their last album, Colorado, from 2019. Not much I could really say about this, but as I said that I'm a huge fan, I think this is one of Neil's best albums in quite a long time. So this has really grown to be one of my new favorite Neil Young albums. So I will absolutely think that it is a very, very well arranged, yet just that rough, ragged sounding rock album with some beautiful folky balladry. So Barn by Neil Young and Crazy Horse at number 14.
That's an interesting choice right there. I know who Neil Young is, and I know like he's very iconic in the music industry, and I'll have to definitely check him out too, because I do know some of his stuff, but not like the rest of the essentials that a lot of people know him best for.
Fair enough.
So coming at number 14, it is by one of my favorite Swedish bands of all time. And I'm so excited when this band finally dropped a new album. This was definitely on my constant rotation, and this album definitely deserves your immediate attention. Coming at number 14 is by the new album by the band Aeon, entitled God Ends Here. In my personal opinion, my favorite Swedish death metal band of all time next to Bloodbath. This was their first album in over a decade after 2012's Aeon's Black, which was my introduction to the band's discography. And to me personally, God Ends Here is the band's most furious, most blackened, most diabolical sounding records they've ever recorded. The album artwork was done by the legendary Paolo Girardi. If you're unfamiliar with his work, he's done albums such as Inquisition, Bell Witch, Disaster, Firespawn, and a hell lot more. With this album, God Ends Here, this is basically Aeon doing what they've done best. This album is a little bit experimental. This album is blackened. This album has old school death metal tinges. Of course, it has the HM2 distorted pedal, which I'm a huge fan of. So any band that does HM2 bands, I'm already a huge fan of. This album is just everything that I want in an Aeon album. It is heavy, eviscerating, crushing, melodic at times, and overall, probably the band's best album in a very long time. So coming at number 14, God Ends Here by Aeon. Absolute fantastic album. The best work they've ever done.
With that band name, I've been very, very familiar with the name for some time, but I need to really dive in with their discography. So with some of these band names and albums, with our separate lists, there will be some new discographies to discover, and maybe for any of you guys who are watching. So sounds pretty cool. Okay, my number 13 album in the list, my first album that was from the Bandcamp website that I did decide to check out, and this is Kal-El with Dark Majesty. So this album, from the band name Kal-El and the lyrical content, very sci-fi inspired, and I believe that Kal-El is like a reference to maybe in the Superman universe. But with the artwork, it did pretty much intrigue me to discover this band. And what this band is, for those that haven't seen the review, this is an album released through Majestic Mountain Records, and it's an independent label, stoner metal type of fruition. But I think this is a very, very good blasting out metal sounding album, and the clean vocals on this album were really, really good. And strangely, that some of the vocal sounds remind me on the vocal performances on Troy Sanders, the way that he expresses his own clean vocal range. But I really, really like so much of this album. It's distorting, it's fuzzy, it's loud. It's, to me, one of these other bands in the upcoming population growing metal bands that you need to discover. So Dark Majesty from Kal-El at number 13.
I remember watching your album review for that album, and I really thought it was well informative because you actually know how to dive into the genre and the history of the band. So I'll definitely check them out, because I'm not really like the biggest fan when it comes to like the stoner side of all music, with the exceptions of like High on Fire and Electric Wizard and so forth. Even Sleep is a great example. I'll definitely check them out for sure. It definitely sounds something I can listen to and be open-minded. Well, I am open-minded to all forms of music, though, especially when it comes to metal. But anyway. Okay, coming at number 13. I will get a lot of shit for this, but I don't really care. This has been one of my favorite modern black metal bands that a lot of people are going to either like or they dislike. And coming at number 13 is by the new album from the band Ghostbath, entitled Self-Loather. One of the most divisive black metal bands in the current era of extreme music. Now, if you don't know who Ghostbath is, they are a depressive, suicidal black metal, post-black metal band from Fargo, North Dakota. And since the band's existence, they play a very depressive, melancholic, atmospheric, and post style of black metal, with also hinges of like atmospheric black metal, little bit of like gothic metal here and there. And I feel like with this album, Self-Loather, being the first album since 2017, Star Mourner, this album released on Nuclear Blast Records, I feel like Ghostbath wanted to create something that was truly magical, spectacular, and a huge grower set aside a part of like their instrumental leads and the craftsmanship and the incredible passages of incredible music brilliancy. This album has aggression, emotion. It's very fluent. There's ambient tones here and there, and also there's some guest appearances from CJ McMahon from Australian death metal deathcore band Thy Art Is Murder in one of the first singles, such as Highway from the Sun. Now, the reason why this album may not be entirely for you is because of the vocals. Now, I understand the vocal point on this album may not be suitable for everyone, kind of like how when someone gets into Immortal and they hear a bass voice, they feel like it's very froggy and it's very impetuous. But if you go in an open mind and just turn your mind off and listen to an album that has some of the most subdued layouts in any black metal album, Self-Loather by Ghostbath is one of those albums. If you're fans of Death Heaven, Alcest, Thy Light, or any band that involves like post black metal with atmospheric black metal influences with fantastic lyricism, definitely check it out. So number 13, Self-Loather by Ghostbath. Absolutely fantastic album.
Since you've mentioned bands like Death Heaven and Alcest, who are a few of one of my other favorite modern bands, I would like to check out that band. So I do like a lot of the sound of the black metal, but onto that terminology, onto darker lyrical contents and suicidal things and stuff, I do appreciate it. So I will have to maybe give that one a spin. Okay, right. My number 12 pick, I was hesitant at first to put this in my top 15. It was going to be one of the higher ranked albums picks in the list, like from 15 or 14, but I just decided to put this in here because, you know, this is absolutely one of their most brutal yet. The first album in the Metal Blade Records label, Cannibal Corpse's Violence Unimagined. So this album, the first album to credit Eric Rutan as replacement for Pat O'Brien, that we know what happened to him. But Eric, what a brilliant replacement. And this album absolutely just slays with some of their most destructive, savage, and just like an eruption of some of their most bombastic sounding tracks they've ever done. There are some points on this album that some of their riffs can have a lot more of the sludgy, but more on their disgusting and grimy sounds of musicianship and the production. The production onto this album is also excellent. And while I will say that other Cannibal Corpse albums in the later period, I will absolutely still regard Torture as one of their top best in a long time. But this one is pretty much on a close second. I really enjoyed albums like A Skeletal Domain, and even Evisceration Plague is one of my favorites, being very underrated as well. But I think that Violence Unimagined is just, as always, very unapologetic, just a destructive way with arguably the most popular and influential death metal band around in the genre's history, and biggest popular one for extreme metal as well. Well, one of the top 5, I'd say. So Violence Unimagined by Cannibal Corpse at number 12.
A very solid choice by one of my all-time favorite death metal bands, and it's hard to say that Cannibal Corpse has not made a single bad album, even with some of the Fisher era and the Barnes era. The whole debate between those two is just they both have their own narrative way. So I feel like I agree wholeheartedly everything about your sentimental values on this Cannibal Corpse record. All right, coming at number 12 is by a death metal band from my neck of the woods, and I'm very proud to even represent them for today. This is a band that I feel like needs more introduction and exposure that they should, and it's under the label 20 Buck Spin, which originally was a record label based in my hometown, but now got relocated to Pennsylvania in the United States of America. And my number 12 album of the year for 2021 is by the new album from the band Cerebral Rot, entitled Excretion of Mortality. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Cerebral Rot, they are a death metal band based of my home state in Seattle, Washington, and the best way to describe them is a monstrous, lurking, disgusting, sewer-like style of death metal in the veins of like Undergang, Faded, Demigod, Demolich. If you're fans of the early to mid 90s of death metal with elements of like doom metal, mid-paced typical death metal speeds, heavier, catchy, and groovy style sounds of the album, you're going to love this album. And the lyrical content is just grotesque, it's depressing, it's decrepit, it's gory, it's unforgiving, it's punishing. This album has so much of these diseases and suffering tracks where you feel like you're listening to a horror movie soundtrack of all these sound effects just crawling under your heebie-jeebies, and you just want to listen to something that's like claustrophobic and dirty and sick and promising. And I feel like this album is a representation of what the earlier death metal bands they were doing during their time. When you're talking about bands like Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Malevolent Creation, Possess, Deicide, Immolation, Incantation. If you're fans of all those bands, definitely check this one out. Excruciation of Mortality by Cerebral Rot. Amazing death metal album that needs more attention.
That does sound very promising. And speaking of Immolation, guys, they have a brand new album coming out next year. So expect me to do an album review for Immolation's new record, and that's another one of the albums that I am anticipated for.
Me too.
All right, so my number 11 with my list, this is the only Rough Trade Records released album for the list, and this was one of my favorite surprises. And as I was watching the long, lengthy live stream of the Metal Meltdown's vinyl collection video, he pulled out this album and it caught my eye, and it's away onto the metal side, but this is the new album from Black Midi called Cavalcade. So this record, one of the most manic, creative, complex, and very inspired albums into the spotlight onto some more progressive, the jazz fusion experimental type of aspects. And I was just in awe by how bombastic and just as a wild record this album was. And I even bought their first album, Schargenheim, on vinyl as well. And I do have Cavalcade on vinyl as well. But this band, this trio from London, UK, definitely needs to get a lot of attention, because this type of stuff is just so out there. It's really, I would say, original as well. Some incredible performances. Each track follows each other in some of the their most adventurous ways possible. Some of the stuff on here reminds me on challenging stuff from King Crimson to maybe some other more of the avant-garde kind of spectrums into this direction of original music. So Cavalcade from Black Midi, one of my personal favorite non-metal albums of this year. So Black Midi, Cavalcade at number 11.
Sounds very complex and exhilarating album, if you ask me. It sounds like it's one of those, like, you have to listen to it more than once to appreciate the value and beauty of its album.
Yeah, it really has that charm for a lot of replay values. So this is a record that would not be really digestible on first listen. Not that it's like so hard on the ear, but there's a lot going on with this. But at the same time, it has a lot of beauty. So please check this out with an open mind, and you will be surprised if you would absolutely dive into this album for the better on repeating listens.
Okay, so my 11th favorite album of 2021 is by perhaps probably one of the most exciting and accessible bands within the technical death metal genre. And I feel like this album needs to get a lot more replay value and appreciation for what it deserves. And I'm talking about the brand new album from the band Ad Nauseam, entitled Imperative Imperceptible Impulse. Now, if you're unfamiliar with them, they are a technical death metal band based out of Italy. And of course, I'm a huge fan of the Italian metal scene. So of course, you got Flesh God Apocalypse, Lacuna Coil, Hour of Penance, so on and so forth. To best describe Ad Nauseam is like if you were to take Deathspell Omega, Consider Dead Era of Gore Guts, and Imperial Triumphant, mix it in the blender to create the most experimental, technical, hallucinating, and avant-garde style of technical death metal with heavy emphasis of black metal here and there. This album is something that you need to digest more than once, because I've been seeing a lot of rave about this album. And I also got to give a shout out to the Metal Meltdown, because he actually talked about this album on one of his videos. And I think he was the main reason why I got into this album. This record is just pummeling, gut-wrenching, and atmospheric at times, where these wonderful soundscapes are just so dense and thick and abstract. And some of the most original, captivating, and almost progressive records I've heard in a very long time. And of course, a lot of the modern era bands of the technical death metal genre are always about the wankery of the guitar riffing, and the drums are not as pummeling and as fierce. But Ad Nauseam, with this record, they've utilized and penetrated into incorporate such different musical aspects that is something that needs to be heard more than once. So if you are fans of Suffering Hour, the first two Gore Guts, Ulcerate, Deathspell Omega, and Artificial Brain, with hints of technical death metal, Blackened Death, avant-garde, this album is for you. So at number 11, Imperative Imperceptible Impulse by Ad Nauseam.
Cool pick. Right, so guys, we are into our top 10. So before I start with the top 10, some of these albums that I did discover were from the Metal Meltdown's selections of some of these albums involving Black Midis, Cavalcade, and some more that will be featured later on in the video. So much love and dedication to the Metal Meltdown. So I know I've mentioned him before, guys, as I've done a video with him on a collaborative effort a few weeks ago on my channel. And if you haven't subscribed to the Metal Meltdown, please do, and give him a lot of the attention, because he truly deserves it. So a quick plug for the Metal Meltdown. Right, so my top 10. My number 10 is Gojira with Fortitude. This record, personally, I think it is a bit more favorable for me than Magma, but yet alone, I think Magma is overhated, and it is still a very brave record. This album follows the kind of similarities about the whole themes onto death, and the whole Fortitude thing is like the will and the power to overcome it. And it's another really big, bold move for the brothers and as well as the rest of the band for making this material like this. But excellent tracks. Amazonia, a political song that's like very Sepultura, Roots era-esque to me every time I play that and hear that track on the Amazonian rainforest. Another World really did grow on me, but this album did have some of my new favorite Gojira tracks on this album, including Sphinx to Into the Storm, and the highlight of this album being Grind. I'm still not a fan of the chant, though. Personally, it is my least favorite number, and to me, one of the weakest tracks that Gojira had put out. But despite this flaw, over time, with a lot of the material on this record, this absolutely still grows with me as an album that has some of my new favorite tracks from this legendary French progressive technical death metal band. So Gojira with Fortitude at number 10, and the first one in my list from Roadrunner Records.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything you say about this record. I still do not understand the hatred that Magma has gotten when it first came out initially, but as over time, it started to become one of my favorite Gojira albums, actually, because it's just so well thought out and emotional and also breathtaking at times. So to see an album like Fortitude is kind of like the same formula as their last record, but they kind of went into a much more, emotional, deep, and immense albums I think they've done probably in a very long time, probably since Lafarge in 2012, I personally think. Okay, so coming at number 10, this is an album that's also another album that I really feel like deserves another praise and attention, and I've been seeing a lot of this album's hype and anticipation from multiple YouTubers, including the Metal Meltdown, Metal Trenches, and other people across the spectrum, and I can see why this album has gotten a lot of praise. And my favorite album, my 10th favorite album of 2021, is from the new album by the band The Lion's Daughter, entitled Skin Show. If you are a fan of progressive metal and blackened sludge, taking elements of Lord Mantis, Coffin Worm, a little bit of Mastodon here and there, put it into blender in a nutshell, this album is just absolutely fantastic. From the band's experimental and diverse-driven albums to the breathtaking atmospheric passages, commendable compositional work, and the arrangements that are so complimented without sounding tormenting or repetitive, Skin Show is an album that may not be suitable for everyone's taste, but if you like the music and the lyrical content behind this album's context, you're going to like every single minute of it. I mean, some of the best songs on this album are almost kind of remind me of watching like a B-slasher horror film, movie flick, with songs like The Chemist, Werewolf Hospital, and Neon Teeth, to other songs like Become the Night, where it has progressive style melodies, melodic interpretative lyricism. Structures are not overly technical, but it's also melodic at times. If you're a fan of that nature of blackened sludge, progressive metal, and also doom here and there, The Skin Show by The Lion's Daughter is probably one of the most underrated albums, not only on my list, but for 2021 as well. So Skin Show by The Lion's Daughter at number 10.
Sounds very cool. My number 9 pick, the only thrash album in the list, and this was released via Napalm Records. Personally, for me, from one of my favorite, or most favorite, I should really say at this point, modern era thrash metal bands, and that is Evil with Hell Unleashed. This album is a big return. This is the first without their previous frontman and guitar player, and the other brother Oliver decides to take over for lead vocals, and he's done a ton of writing for this album, and this is their most mentally insane, fastest sounding album yet. The production was just so huge and pretty monstrous. The shredding on this thing was just as ballistic. Some powerful musicianship as well, done from other members, Joel, Ben, and Adam. These guys, especially this lineup of Evil, definitely still sounds as awesome and really, really monstrous and very rhythmic. This is a tight sounding album as well. It's a dominating one at that. Not my favorite album from Evil. Probably my favorite is Five Serpents' Teeth. But this album from Evil, well worth it. Well worth of the return after 8 years from one of the UK's best modern era sounding thrash bands. So Evil, Hell Unleashed at number 9.
I am very picky when it comes to certain bands in the thrash metal genre. Of course, you know, the Big Four and the Teutonic German scene, but there's also some really great thrash metal bands out there in the current era of the genre. And I feel like Evil are probably one of the most overlooked bands in the bands. Well, probably the most overlooked thrash bands, but I'm sure they're really popular, but they're not like the same kind of level as like other bands like, I don't know, Destruction and all that other good stuff. So I'll definitely check it out and see what the album's really all about. Okay, so coming in at number 9 for my favorite album 2021 list. And I'm going to make someone very happy about this album. And I want to give a huge shout out to our boy, Richard Metal Fan, who is a really great YouTuber. Definitely subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. Great guy, super nice. Would love to drink a beer with him some other day. And my favorite album of 2021 for number 9 is by one of his favorite bands and one of my all-time favorite bands. And I'm talking about the new album from the band Cradle of Filth, Existence is Futile.
Ooh.
This album is perhaps the greatest album Cradle of Filth has ever done in the modern day era of the band's career. I know a lot of people do not like the later half of the album after they transition themselves into a more of a melodic, extreme, gothic style band, but this album is what they should have been aeons ago. This album has everything that a dream fan like me, who's been listening to Cradle of Filth since high school, and while Methamphetamine is still my favorite Cradle of Filth album in the band's catalog, Existence is Futile is basically taking the last couple of albums, Cryptoriana, The Seductives and the Decay, and Hammer of the Witches, combine those two albums and make it into this theatrical, cinematic, symphonic-driven album, which is very unusual to say because Cradle of Filth do use symphonics into their music, but they don't over-rely on how they should do it. Like, they know what to do to make this album so theatrical and also sinistering at times. Like, I'm almost listening to an early Dimmu Borgir recorded album. And this album, to me, Existence is Futile, is a record that the more I listen to it, the better and better of each listen has gotten. This record has not been on my playlist for such a very long time. So Existence is Futile by Cradle of Filth, probably the best modern day album of the band's existence. And I'm actually very curious what they're going to take in the next album and then the next album, because Cradle of Filth are either a band that you love or you don't like, whether it's the vocals or the band's maturity or the way they dress themselves. I'm all about the music for the music itself. This album is absolutely fantastic. So come at number 9, Existence is Futile by Cradle of Filth. Fucking amazing album.
It's very funny. I've been actually meaning still to check out the new Cradle of Filth album, yet alone I did not have any chance to review the new record. And while I really, really like quite a lot of Cradle of Filth, I know they came out and for some reason I was skipping it because I was listening to many more other new albums. And now that that's been mentioned, I should really dive into it. And
You
should have
need
been.
to. If you love their last two albums, you're gonna love this one.
Yeah, so I will have to check it out. You may need to reposition the camera a little bit higher, mate. Anyway, yeah, something like that. There you go. Yeah, Cradle of Filth. They were one of the first extreme metal bands that I've discovered when I was getting into metal music, and I know that the new album has got some pretty praised reviews. So I will fucking dive in to this album. All right. So my number 8 from one of the very first metal bands of all time that I have discovered. For just a long amount of time, this band has been my personal favorite in the industrial metal genre, alongside with others involving Strapping Young Lad and some nail bomb bit of Ministry. But this band has given me the most nostalgia. And funnily enough, one of the founders of this band did comment on my review on this album. And I'm talking about Fear Factory with Aggression Continuum. This
There we go.
album, personally for me, is Fear Factory's best album since Archetype. I mean, I've grown to be a big fan of Archetype, but really the classic albums like Demanufacture to Obsolete. I even love Digimortal as well, but Aggression Continuum has a lot of moments where there were some points where there are some more of the keyboard orchestrated type of fruition on some of the tracks here, especially on most of the choruses. But this album, for me, does deliver very, very well. And another one on the Nuclear Blast Records label. This album, for the finale moment for Burton C. Bell, to hear him for the last time under the Fear Factory name, it was really worth it because Dino with Burton, two very important men for growing Fear Factory's sound that I absolutely still adore listening to. I've been a big fan of Fear Factory for a very long time. This does have some of my favorites on this record, like Disruptor, the title track, Manufactured Hope, and but this one, as I said, being the last with Burton C. Bell, he did very, very well. And I know some people are a little bit nitpicky about the orchestra part on this record, but I really have been absorbing this album pretty much quickly, and this is one of the best Fear Factory albums in a long time, and I'm very, very happy that this album just came out with its own identity and bringing a vengeance into the metal world. So Fear Factory, Aggression Continuum at number 8.
A very fantastic album. I feel like it's going to be really hard to not see Burton C. Bell anymore because he is Fear Factory, and I don't feel like no one is ever going to replace the amount of dignity and attitude and aggressiveness that he has created over the years with some of the best albums in extreme metal history. I mean, Fear Factory are one of the main reasons why I've been a huge fan of the band and one of the my gateways into extreme metal. And I will always hold Obsolete as my number one favorite Fear Factory record. And of course, records like Digimortal, Archetype, and Mechanized are just flawless. And I feel like they do have some of their bad albums, but I feel like this album is basically just like a love letter to thank the fans for their continuous support. And even though people may not like Dino Cazares with all the controversies going on with the band and filing the lawsuit and shit, which I'm not going to go over about, but for what the music is for this record, absolutely fantastic. I feel like this is some of Burton C. Bell's best vocal work since Archetype.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so coming in at number 7 for my favorite album of 2021 list. This is a band that I have been following for well over a decade now, and I got to see them 3 times, I would say. And I actually got to see these guys live this past September after the whole, not touring with COVID or touring with, with COVID going on. And this album pretty much just kind of like uplifted my spirits. And when I got to see this band live back in past September, I knew this album was going to be on my end of the year list. And I'm sure a lot of people will probably agree with me or disagree. So my favorite album, my 7th favorite album of 2021 is by one of my favorite deathcore bands of all time, and that is Carnifex with the album Graveside Confessions. I've been a huge Carnifex fan since I was 16, 17 years old. I got into them around 2010 after hearing their album Hell Chose Me, which is probably their most underrated album in the band's catalog. Now, it's safe to say that Carnifex are probably one of the most originated bands in the deathcore genre back when the MySpace era really happened, when you had bands like All Shall Perish, Despise Icon, Through the Eyes of the Dead, As Blood Runs Black, and a whole lot more. But to me, Carnifex are one of the most well-known, hard-working, and respected bands, not only in the extreme metal world for deathcore and death metal, but I have the most ultimate respect for this band because they keep up with their fans on Instagram. And I also got to give a huge shout out to Sean Cameron for the drummer of Carnifex because he made it possible. I got to meet with him after the show. Super nice guy, loves his fans. If you haven't seen them live, go definitely check this one out. This album is just accessible, dark, heavy, blackened at times. They went into more of a blackened symphonic approach within this album, but there's some black metal and death metal tinges here and there because the vocalist of Carnifex, Scott Ian Lewis, is a huge fan of Cradle of Filth and Emperor, and he also loves nu metal because there's some nu metal components within the guitar melodies. And also, I know a lot of people are not going to like this for what I'm about to say, but their cover for Korn's Dead Bodies Everywhere is actually a pretty cool cover. I mean, if you really think about it, it's really like a homage to them because the members of Carnifex are huge fans of Korn. But I really like the whole atmosphere on this album because of how dense and sinister and incredibly clean this album really is. And this is probably the best produced album that Carnifex has done to date. And I feel like if you're a fan of Carnifex, then you know what to fully expect. This is an absolute flawless album, in my personal opinion. Not my favorite in the band's catalog, but over time it will grow. So coming at number 7, Graveside Confessions by Carnifex. Absolute banger start to finish.
My number 7 pick, this was originally in my top 5, but this is still to me an album that will be personally described for me as maybe their best album in a long time. I know that you've mentioned this album briefly in your time, so I won't talk about it that much here, but number 7 is Trivium's In the Court of the Dragon. So I absolutely think this is, personally for me, a massive, not improvement, but a massive shift from what their last album was, which I really enjoy their last album. But personally, as a Trivium fan myself, I think their previous album was a bit on the overhyped point. But with this record, surprisingly, after a year, this album is just amazing. This, to me, has some of their best, most rhythmic, their most versatile arrangements yet. And including tracks like The Phalanx to the title track, Like a Sword Over Damocles. And with the musicianship on this, Alex Bent's drumming, just as wild, and some of his best yet. Matt Heafy's vocals, some of the other really strong aspects of performances. He has grown so much as a vocalist, and as well as with the other members, with their technicality, their adventure moves of writing music, and even with the production from Josh Wilbur, just brilliant stuff. And you can't forget the opening track onto this album, which really sets the vibe and the mood for this album. And I think this is possibly maybe Trivium's best album. That's going to surpass The Sin and the Sentence, which is another very good record. But I was really in awe by this record, and I just couldn't believe that to follow up their last album with this record is just, personally for me, their best album in ages in their discography. In the Court of the Dragon by Trivium at number 7.
Not much to say about Trivium. Like we said before, they are one of the best modern bands in the current era of metal music in general. And I feel like it's a well-deserved album. So I definitely agree that this album is their best in a long time. Okay, so coming in at number 6, it is by one of my favorite black metal bands of all time, and I was super stoked that this album has finally dropped after 4.5 years prior to the last album. This band has been around for almost 20 years in their existence, and it's hard to even say that how far this band has truly came along involved in the realms of black metal. And coming at number 6 is the new album from one of my hometown heroes, Wolves in the Throne Room, entitled Primordial Arcana. I don't think it's hard to say that Wolves in the Throne Room are one of the most well-structured, complex, experimental, and astronomical sounding bands within the black metal genre. And for a band that's been around for almost 20 years, and only originally a 2-piece, but now they've added a third member who does the live session recordings on this album. This album is just so fascinating. Everything about the craftsmanship, the American black metal signatures, and also incorporate elements of like atmospheric black metal. There's some progressive metal tinges here and there. And the instrumentation, the synthesizers almost reminded me of listening to a 1980s movie soundtrack. And some songs are just technical and sporadic and ritualistic in such a way, almost kind of reminds me of listening to a band like Nightbringer or Dark Funeral, where it's not just overly fast and technical and in your face. But this album is a rejuvenated album that is basically a return to form within the band's sound. And personally, I feel like this is the best album they've ever done since Black Cascade. And Black Cascade is my favorite Wolves in the Throne Room album to date. So this album, it really showcases the maturity, the distinctiveness, the bombarding screeches of pure intensity and onslaught and emotionally driven passages. This album, Primordial Arcana, is one of the best modern sounding albums the band has ever done. So if you're fans of black metal with hinges of like atmospheric black metal and also some post and also some ritualistic soundscapes with ambient undertones, Primordial by Arcana by Wolves in the Throne Room deserves to be on your listening watch list, and for that reason is number 6.
That is another band name that I've heard numerous people talk about, and I know that their new album has been out, and I didn't really discover that one nor their previous records, but I will have to really think about giving them a chance. So I'll remind myself for that.
Definitely do so. It's not for everyone, but if you love that style of what they do, then this album is pretty much just like, it's one of those albums where I basically fall asleep to it. It's ritualistic and it's also ambient. So definitely check it out.
Will do, and I do love quite a lot of ambient music. So, okay, my number 6, my personal favorite Bandcamp released album of 21, as I decided to review this album, and the guys very kindly shared my review on the band's Facebook, and that is Callous with a Breath of Flesh Air. So this record, this is another album that was released through a label that's pretty independent, and this is pretty much like what I've described from Kal-El's Dark Majesty, but this has a lot more groove. And I absolutely love the tonality and the massive production on this, because the guitar's distortion on this album sounded really pretty thick, and as well as the prominent bass tones and drums. Very catchy stuff, especially on to Quartet. Molar Crown is fantastic, and Toadfish, vocally, performance-wise, I may have mentioned this in my review, or I may not. I don't think I did, maybe. But I think that the vocal harmonies do remind me of Alice in Chains. But musically, with this kind of flavor, it is groovy, but it has that kind of stone metal kind of aspect. But it's just as a great, brilliant album from an upcoming, up and rising British band from Preston, UK. So definitely check out Callous, A Breath of Flesh Air, from the record label. I think it was, here we go, Trepanation Records. Awesome album. Much love to the guys from Callous. Thank you very much for sharing the review. And Bandcamp has been quite a big discovery for new albums for me, as I've mentioned about a few in the list, but this is my personal favorite that I've discovered. Callous, A Breath of Flesh Air at number 6.
I've heard the band name numerous times all over on Bandcamp, and I've know very few little people talking about this album, and it sounds to me it's probably one of those, listen to it once in order to appreciate the art and nature of the record. So I'll definitely give it a whirl and see what I have to say about it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you'll dig it.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so coming in at number 5. Now, my list for 5 for 1 has been very, very difficult, especially coming down into this aisle. Now, all these albums I listed are the ones I listen to the most consecutively. And I will say this right now. Coming in at number 5 is actually an album that you listed in your top favorite of 2021. And I actually mentioned them to them earlier in the making of this video. And coming in at number 5 it's obvious. I mean, they are kings of all kings. It's the new Cannibal Corpse album, Violence Unimagined, at number 5. Without Cannibal Corpse, I would not be into death metal at all. These guys have been one of the most consistent bands in the history of death metal. And of course, over the course of their existence, with Chris Barnes delivering some of the most quintessential albums in the band's career, from Eating Back to Life through Bleeding, and then George Fisher's time with Vile and onward, Cannibal Corpse has never really made a bad album. In my personal opinion, I think this is the best sounding album the band has done since Torture, if not probably since Kill, because Eric Rutan not only produced the album, but he's also a permanent member of the band, and his contributions on this album laid a foundation of how to excel and to accelerate in making an album that is just thrashy and aggressive. And of course, if you know Cannibal Corpse, you are very well known that they are just innovators within the old school death metal realms, and they've inspired so many upcoming bands. And over the years of the band's existence, they put out some consistency after consistent albums and just constant touring, and seeing them evolve and being a band for such a long period of time, it's really just a wonderful discovery. And of course, with Eric Rutan being the mix on this album, it is just so jaw-dropping. And I feel like his guitar playing and his virtuoso with Alex Webster and Paul Mazurkiewicz, and of course George Corpsegrinder Fisher, this album is just balls to the wall, just heavy and just non-stop in your face. And I feel like this is probably the best sounding Cannibal Corpse album in a very long time. So coming at number 5 is Violence Unimagined by Cannibal Corpse. What an incredible album, and a return to form.
as much as I love a lot of the direction in the George era of the band, and with Pat O'Brien being a monster of a guitar player, I think that Eric has definitely boosted up the sound of the band even further than before, I think. And I think that its tone and production is absolutely one of their best. It's to me as a ravenous sounding album like the Wretched Spawn or even Bloodthirst. So I absolutely I absolutely think that it is maybe one of their best albums in a very long time. Okay, so my top five, guys. I do have my top five albums on CD, but the top five are just special to me as the others that I've shown in the video. I decided to show them on vinyl. So my number five album, this is an album that was my most anticipated of the year, coming from, to me, my favorite progressive metal band, and that is Mastodon with Hushed and Grim.
Ooh.
So this album it's a very brave album, and we know that this album is a dedication to their manager Nick John, who had passed away from cancer, and this record really did have such a very moving, bold, uh, vivid imagery. But what really just stands out is that a lot of the songs on this album, to me, follow each other very, very well. While there are a few tracks that I do like that I don't really attach with as much as others, this album is possibly for me the band's best album in a long time, although I am quite a big fan of Once More Round the Sun. So even though the production and the mixing is the only little issue that I have with this, but this album, with its maturity, as they've been mature since Crack the Sky, the differences in tone and music arrangements, this is absolutely one of those albums that will just resonate into me, as that I actually did pre-order the album on CD and the t-shirt of the album's cover art, because I just couldn't wait for the anticipation to really escalate. But when it came out, it did take some time to absorb, being the longest album as well, the only double album in my list as well, guys. So I really, really think this is an awesome album from Mastodon. Hushed and Grim at number five via the record label of Reprise Records.
And I know for a reason too that it is a very divisive album, not because it's also one of the longest albums by Mastodon has ever done, but also they didn't really feel like it was like a Mastodon's album like Crack the Sky or Leviathan or even The Hunter. So I can definitely understand that that album may not entirely be for you. But if you were a longtime Mastodon fan and liked the evolution of what they've done, then that album would likely be something to grow on and to appeal of.
Yeah, so for me, Hushed and Grim was a record that people were on the offense about, but it really has to take into a feeling of, the more you listen to it, the more you will be attaching yourself to it. So I know that some fans don't like this album, and I know a few, and especially with people saying that it's not a very good album or just one of the weakest. But the album, personally for me, is the only Mastodon album that will not be for all of the fans, and especially like with people criticizing about The Hunter and Once More Round the Sun, and some people criticize Emperor of Sand, but I think that Mastodon's discography is entirely flawless, with not all albums being classics, but I am always more of the fan on the first four albums. But with Once More Round the Sun, Hushed and Grim is grown for me as one of my favorites from Mastodon.
And that is pretty well articulated and descriptive too, especially for a band like them that's been involved for so many years and just being one of the most recognizable acts in the 21st century too. So they basically have foundated what they became over the years. Okay, so coming in at number 4 is it's another black metal band from one of my favorite extreme metal labels known as Transcending Obscurity Records, a record label based out of India, and I'm actually really good friends with the record label owner. So I gotta give a huge shout out to him for hooking me up with this album and also sending me merchandise of this band's first 2 albums and some merchandise as well. So very thankful for them to do that. So coming in at number 4 is from the new album by the band Imperialist entitled Zenith. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Imperialist, they are a Californian black metal band that's been around for quite some time. And if you were to tell me, if I were to travel back in time during the mid to late 90s and quite possibly the early 2000s, and you were to tell me who my favorite black metal band was during the time of the formations with other bands like Dark Funeral, Satyricon, early Gorgoroth, Volcandra, Old Man's Child, or Nalfagar, and you were to tell me like who is the best upcoming black metal band, it would definitely be Imperialist. Because this is the band's second full-length album, and what's so special about this record is if you are fans of early Immortal with some progressive thrash elements of Vector, and if you like Far Away from the Sun era of Sacramentum, and if you love the first 2 Emperor albums, Zenith by Imperialist is this album for you. This album is gorgeous, it's ambitious, it's soaring, it's adventurous, and the lyrical content behind this album is truly worth a discover to listen to, because if you're a fan of science fiction, outer space, and philosophical themes with this naturalistic impression to see where the band was taken care of and wanted to maintain a style that's raw and comfortable, ambient, and atmospheric at times, with a much more claustrophobic effectiveness, Zenith by Imperialist is this album for you. So if you're fans of melodic black metal or traditional black metal or even some thrash metal tinges here and there, Zenith by Imperialist is my favorite black metal album of the year and definitely worth your attention.
Definitely sounds cool with me. Right. Number 4. Maybe my most controversial pick in the list.
Boy, bring on the hate comments.
Some people will have their own views on this album, but since this is a band that went from their most popular phase of a genre and to change things entirely different, releasing this new album from a genre that's one of my all-time favorites, Death Heaven Infinite Granite.
Ooh.
So this record is always targeted for many fans, and while I am a fan of the critically acclaimed Sunbather and New Bermuda, 2 albums that are one of my favorites of the last decade, and I really liked Ordinary Corrupt Human Love as well, Infinite Granite, since I'm a fan of shoegaze with bands like My Bloody Valentine and early Ride, etc. This was absolutely on my radar for the tones and the production of the sound of shoegaze. I think this production, while it does sound big for a lot of people, it's beautiful. And I think George's vocals on this album are very clean. Some people say it's very nasal, but I think nasal is quite a part for vocal performances and tone. I really do love quite a lot of this album. The textures, the atmospheres, and with some of the best performances, especially the drumming on this record, it is just crisp, it's dynamic, and while I will say that this is not their best album. I will say that, because New Bermuda or Sunbather is my favorite. But this record, into the sonics, the direction, I think this is a very brave record from Deafheaven. And I think that this is, for me, a gorgeous album. So, number 4, Infinite Granite from Deafheaven on the Sargent House label.
I remember the longest time when Deafheaven first came in the scene, everyone claimed that they're just a bunch of, they're like a fake black metal and like post rock and all that stuff. But no, I don't. I feel like Deafheaven, in the way that they're going right now with this new era that they're going for in terms of the Black Shoegaze album, I think it works just flawlessly. And I feel like shoegaze just needs to be more appreciated for what it is. And of course, you know, shoegaze being a genre that I'm not really associated with, fair enough, but I do know the genre and what it stands for. So actually, the new Deafheaven was very close being my end of the year list, but I haven't give it more time and more deciphers into the album. But from what I've heard, it's a fucking good album, and I still think it's probably the most diverse sounding album, and probably the most diverse extreme metal albums of the year, personally, if you call them that. But
yeah, I will say that these guys, I guess, are involved in extreme metal, but for the black gaze, black metal tradition type of sound earlier on, they were pretty original and heavy at the time. And I will say, just because that this album is entirely different does not mean that it's all bad. I mean, anybody has their own opinions about a band like these guys, but I think that Infinite Granite is one of my top favorite albums of the year, for the sheer change of atmosphere, the words, and just the whole wide imagery that this album does achieve by itself. And I know it's a record that's not for everybody, and fuck you to the haters, because Deafheaven are a talented band, and whether you call them fake or a bad band or not, they are very gifted, talented musicians in their own right who do make music. So there you go. Infinite Granite at number 4.
wow, that's quite the spark, and I don't blame you one bit.
Yeah.
All right, so coming in at number 3. Now, it was kind of hard between picking number 3 and number 2. They were interchangeable at times, but I feel like this is going to be a very well, deserved ranking for this particular matter. And this is another death metal band, of course, being a huge fanboy I am of the genre. This band has been getting a lot of praise, a lot of recognition, constant touring rotations, and they became one of the most exciting and accessible bands within the old school death metal genre. And I am a huge fan of the new era of the current wave of death metal, and this band is perhaps one of the best examples of how to perform death metal correctly. And coming at number 3 is by the new album from the band, Frozen Soul, entitled Crypt of Ice.
Oh, that is... before you continue, I was actually at first going to put that album in my honorable mentions, but I will leave you to it.
Frozen Soul is a band that I feel is a prime example of how to contain such jaw-dropping, exhilarating, grimy, grindy style of death metal that is basically in the veins of Bolt Thrower, and there's a lot of Bolt Thrower similarities within the vocal layers and the instrumentation and the drums and the production, giving that raw aesthetic mid to late 90s style, basically kind of like Suffocation doing it, or Deicide, or Jungle Rot in such a way. Crypt of Ice from Frozen Soul was actually, believe it or not, a fun fact, was actually the first review I've ever done for my website, and one of most recognizable reviews I've ever done throughout the entire year, because the band shared it on their social media. Central Media replied to my review and they gave me a share. So that review kind of gave me the spark of appreciating the underground death metal scene. And I'm so happy that Frozen Soul is getting the treatment that they rightfully deserve. They were on tour with bands like Sing with Shukabog and Inoculation, another great underground death metal band from the same state of Ohio, but Frozen Soul are a band from Texas. And after releasing a demo and then transitioning to a full length, this album is just gritty, it's icy, and it's just full of wonderful, captivating experiences of a lifetime. So Crypt of Ice by Frozen Soul deserves your immediate attention. One of the best bands of the current era of death metal, and it deserves to be on my top 5. So coming number 3, Crypt of Ice by Frozen Soul. Absolutely remarkable album. Enough said.
It is another awesome album for another upcoming and growing popular style metal band, and I absolutely do agree that the bolt thrower similarities are really presentable, and I really like that murky, chilling pun kind of sound that this album is. So that's another band, guys, that you should definitely check out. And Frozen Soul are another very, very good Texas-formed death metal band. And yeah, a few quick plugs for anybody who's watching this video to check out these bands. I mean, there are some that I've not heard about from Jake's list at all that I need to dive in, like Wolves in the Throne Room and other stuff. But anyways, yeah, Crypt of Ice, excellent record.
For sure.
My number 3. This was close to being my favorite comeback album of the year. After 8 years of their last record, and I know that Jake has mentioned it before, and it was 8 years of high anticipation, yet alone they've released their EP before the release of this, and while it's not, to me, their strongest album in the discography, because the second to latest album, the previous album, is near perfect, and that is Carcass, Torn Arteries. And this album, if I have to really think about this record, it is personally maybe their most variety sounding record in the newer age of the discography. And there are some extreme performances on this album, and even some of the cleanest, most aesthetic and beautiful guitar tones, especially with the shredding leads that I've heard on any album from this band. The vocals, personally, like Onto Surgical Steel, just a raw, gross, just like a distinctive type of sound. And this production is pretty much like Surgical Steel in a way, but this has elements on some doom, some kind of thrashy, twin guitar, heavy metal styles. I mean, it is like just a big kaleidoscope of many different styles along the way. And while I do think that Surgical Steel is the band's best album since Heartwork, and especially the one before Heartwork, but this album is, to me, one of the best in their discography, and my personal favorite album on the Nuclear Blast Records label too. So Carcass, Torn Arteries at number 3.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with you on that. It may not be as strong or as accessible as Surgical Steel was, but it's still a flawless album start to finish.
Brilliant.
Okay. Wow. Number 2 and number 1 were so fucking close, and I'm actually going to have a heartbreak right now, so I hope you guys bear with me on this. But Number two is, of course, if you guys have followed me on my Instagram, you will know that I am probably the biggest fan of this band you'll ever meet. I got to see them live 3 times. I got to interview them in 2018 and 2019, respectively. And I have been a fan of them since my teenage years. And if it wasn't for this band, I would not be a fan of like Devourment, Cal Decapitation, Ananda Thrak, so on and so forth. Coming in at number 2 is by one of my top 10 favorite bands of all time lists. And this is the new album from the band Aborted with Mania Cult. I've been a huge fan of these guys since middle school. After seeing one of their songs, Dead Reckoning, off the MTV's Music Headbangers Ball, back when MTV played real music and not the shitty drama shows like My Super Sweet 16. For fuck's sake, get that shit out of my newsfeed. But Aborted has been a very special band in my dearest heart. I have been a fan of them for so many years, even the weaker albums like Surgery 1.2.3, I think that's what's called. It's one of their weaker albums in their discography, but everything else that these guys have created over the course of their existence has just been flawless come to back. And with Mania Cult, this is the band's furious, frantic, grindy, compulsive, and death grind, death metal inspired albums the band has ever done, probably since 2003's Gormageddon, The Saw, and the Carnage Done, which arguably speaking is the band's magnum opus for an album that came out almost 20 years ago. Hard to believe. And Mania Cult is an album that features everything that I love about Aborted. There is elements of grindcore, death grind, melodic death metal, traditional death metal. There's elements of like Carcass-esque Heartwork style melodies where they fall into the same category and equation of having these songs feel fresh and not as generic, so to speak. And the vocals are just as visceral and upfront as it possibly has ever sounded. And the double bass drumming is just so well articulated and furious and infectious, jackhammering onslaughts after another just makes this album so goddamn precise and absolutely remarkable in every way, shape, or form. Now, I will say that Mania Cult does have its flaws. It does sound a little bit repetitive on the secondary half of this album, as well as the first half, but don't let that get to you, because if you are a Aborted fan and you know what they've done over the course of their years, known for their grotesque, unsettling, and amazing quality records throughout their career with albums like Global Flatline, The Necrotic Manifesto, and then the last album being TerrorVision, Mania Cult is the band's best album since Global Flatline, released in 2012. And if you are fans of Ananda Thrak, Cal Decapitation, Carcass, or anyone in that vein of metal, Mania Cult by Aborted is just absolutely fantastic. And I even ranked it a perfect 10 out of 10. The band shared it on my Instagram, and also Central Media shared it as well. And also I want to give a huge shout out to the boys from Aborted. They're actually personal friends of mine, and they're fans of my website. So a huge shout out for everything that you guys have done, and I cannot wait to see you guys live. So Mania Cult by Aborted, number 2 on my 2021 year list.
That is awesome, and it is truly deserving that any band just decides to check out and discover a review through a lot of major big productions and publications of companies, but through smaller up and rising labels of reviewing albums like yours. I mean, it's just great that they do care about what anyone has to say about their music. So I absolutely appreciate any band that would definitely be just be at the mindset of deciding to check something out and share it around to other people. So that's just a great thing to have.
Absolutely. And bands like Aborted are the main reasons why I respect them even more. They care about their fans, and they're all in for the music. And that's what I love about death metal, is they have some of the most compassionate fans out there. So they definitely deserve to be on my list.
Awesome. My number two, my second favorite album of the year, my main favorite Relapse Records label. My number two is Genghis Tron Dream Weapon. Now, when I was diving into this, I did not know what to expect. I mean, this was my first introduction to this band. This is their first album in over 10 years, and their previous two albums, while I've not heard them yet, are like very math metal experimental-ish. This is totally the opposite of that. This album is very proggy, but it has a lot of very ambient synthesizer meditative textures, and it's absolutely amazing. And this album was very consistent for me to really absorb and appreciate a lot of this album's direction. And with just a few lyrics, the music really does a lot of the talking, and some of the playing on this album is very rhythmic, and it's at the same time beautiful. Some of the instrumentation of passages do make me think on some of my other favorite bands, and this is just a discovery that was well worth the surprise. And I love a lot of this album, and definitely check out this band if you haven't already, guys. So from Relapse Records, Genghis Tron Dream Weapon at number two.
That's another band and album I've never been diving into, but definitely worth checking out, especially from your descriptive and interpretation on this album. It's just like I said before, it's one of those albums where it's just emotionally driven and captivating to even listen to an album that's just, it's for the soul and for the heart from these bands. So I'll definitely have to listen to it whenever I'm able to.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we're coming in at the number one spot, and nice. I knew you were gonna do that. Okay, so my number one favorite album of 2021. This has been a very exciting year for extreme metal music of all across the spectrum of death metal, black metal, doom, gothic, folk, power metal, just all these wonderful genres bringing us some joy and excitement, and to make our minds to be distracted from all the bullshit that's been going on in our world right now. And I couldn't even think of any good album that has really won my heart over. And this album is definitely deserving to be my number one favorite album of 2021. And it's also, again, by my top 10 favorite death metal bands of all time. I got to see them live with Carnifex and the Black Dahlia Murder. And spoiler alert, you probably know what you guys know what already it is. My number one favorite album of 2021 is by the new album from the band Rivers of Nile, entitled The Work. This is a very divisive album for a lot of reasons, and for many reasons only. Because in 2018, they released, in my opinion, the band's best album they've ever recorded with the album Where Owls Know My Name. It was a huge skyrocketing album that just blew up sky high. They gained so much popularity. They sell out consecutive shows and became one of the most fascinating bands within the technical death metal, progressive death metal subgenre categories. With this album, The Work, it follows up exactly the same formula of Where Owls Know My Name, but they decided to take it a little more further into their sound direction. And of course, they do have a lot of showcasing to know that this band has matured. They dive into a lot more of a deeper, more of a melodic side, and also a jazz-inspired record, because this album does have some saxophone arrangements, which I really appreciate in a technical death metal album, because a lot of the band's like early Death and Atheist, so to speak, were able to use jazz fusion influences, and also Cynic is a great example that they use jazz into their compositional writing. With this album, The Work, this is an album that I wasn't really a fan of at first sight. Now, but after I heard this album on constant rotation, this album just blew me away the moment I've heard the singles and I got the promo from Metal Blade Records, which they've been on a fascinating roll of 2021 releases. The Work is an album that really caught my eye and just caught my heart and my emotion because I never felt an album that I was so attached to, because this album resonates how I feel about life. This record is about life. It's about death. It's about emotion. It's about a story that each song represents different identities and characters to be represented here. And the context of this album is just marvelous. You have an album that has the most talented, the most professional, and most artistic bands within the upcoming era of techno death metal. And these guys from Pennsylvania are on their way to make the genre not only as accessible and exciting as it is, but some of the songs on this album reminds me of a lot of progressive metal influences, whether it be early Faith No More or Tool. There's even a song that reminded me of Mr. Bungle, preferably from the clean vocal aspects of this song. And I feel like Rivers of Nile are just probably one of the most exciting bands within the technical death metal, progressive death metal spectrum. But with that being said, this album, I've been listening to it nonstop. It's been on my constant rotation since the day of its release. And if you are fans of bands like Black Crown Initiate, Fallujah, Obscura, Nablia Scaris, with a philosophical, experimental, and jazz-inspired elements of technical death metal and progressive death metal with amazing, memorable replay value, definitely worth it checking this one out. And for that being said, The Work by Rivers of Nile is my #1 favorite album of 2021.
Sounds awesome. And with the other band mentions that you've said, it's very, very much a big curiosity for me to dive in. So there are a lot of records that you have addressed from bands that I obviously haven't heard of yet alone. I've said the same thing a few times in this video, but some of them are going to be very much worth it when I will be hopefully reminding myself to discover a lot. So very, very solid list. So there are some picks. There are some picks that I really do like. And the Cradle of Filth one was like the main album that I should dive in the most. I check this out and review it. And yeah, I should have done that. So awesome list.
And the Frozen Soul.
Yeah, the Frozen Soul one. For those who haven't heard of that one's very good. Crypt of Ice. So brilliant list.
Thank you.
My #1, my favorite album of the year, and my favorite album on the Metal Blade Records label as well. When this came out in January, I've played this on repeat massively. This was the biggest introduction, the biggest surprise that I've ever discovered from any band this year. And this band, along with Black Midi's Cavalcade and also Genghis Tron's Dream Weapon, along with this record, were very big new discoveries after watching several reviews from the Metal Meltdown. Another mention for him. But my #1 favorite album of 21, Dread Sovereign, Alchemical Warfare.
Wow.
This album is their third release, and it does have one of the members from a different band called Primordial. And this record, it's got to be one of the biggest, menacing, and thickest sounding stoner doom metal albums that I've ever discovered, and especially with just the big and dominating tone. The distortion on the guitars on this album are so fucking cranked up that it's just like it's erupting. The drums on this were really very basic, but they are so effective, especially that rumbling bass sound. The vocals on this are just fantastic. This album is really memorable. The more I play this album, this does have some incredible tracks. And the one song that I was really just excited to hear the rest of this album when it did eventually came out was Nature is the Devil's Church. And some of the stuff on this album, fuzz guitar sound wise, reminds me of early Black Sabbath, like a Master of Reality type of tone. But there's a lot of performance, there's a lot of depth on this record. And I also really do admire their cover of You Don't Give a Fuck. But this record is powerful. It's just as a menace of a metal album that this record is going to be one of my new main contenders of one of my main favorite metal albums of the decade. And this was just something out of this world for those that are into this type of sound of metal. As much as I have talked about the other albums in this list, there's no other album that I could have put in this spot than this one. And as I was really thinking about this, really playing this on repeat, it just got better. I love a lot of this stuff on this album. There's barely a flaw about this album because of just how dominating this album is. And this album is my main number one favorite album of 21, Dread Submarine, Alchemical Warfare from Metal Blade Records.
An unexpected number one, because I remember that was one of your main reviews on the channel too.
Yes, and it was one of the first ones that I've ever reviewed, and with just the main interest because of the Metal Meltdowns review and seeing it on Bandcamp and other people talking about it, it was just my main favorite album for a lot of these reasons. And there's just so much power and dread and some dramatic performances of the musicianship and the whole vibe the album did begin to sound as soon as I always put it on. And Alchemical Warfare is absolutely one of those albums that I will never ever get bored of. Like I said, a very big metal album contender for one of my favorite albums of this decade. So there you go, Alchemical Warfare by Dread Submarine at number one.
And there you have it, you guys, is our favorite albums of 2021. Let us know in the comments down below, because I do see your comment, I do see his comments, and I do like them, because that's all about. We're music people for music purposes, and we would love to know what your favorite albums of 2021 was. Even if they're ones that we didn't mention before, we would still love to hear what your feedback is.
And with that being said, guys, that is the entire video of our top 15 favorite albums of 21 with some honorable mentions. And just like what Jake said, please share your list in the comments below, and we will see what your views are on albums that have been your favorites throughout 2021. I just want to say thank you very much to SeditionThroughScorns for participating in this collaborative video.
And thank you so much for having me, man. This has been an absolute blast, and hopefully 2022 will make another continuous year of amazing banging albums. And before we do our shameless promotion plug or whatever soever, I just want to say that I'm really glad that you're doing really well and you're finding yourself of who you are. You've been a great supporter of mine, and it really means the world to me that you're doing so much better. And I know it's been a really rough patch for myself personally, because 2021 was a very difficult year for me personally, like as much as 2020 was. So for those who are watching this video, just know that you are not alone. And if you are feeling that you are struggling, please contact me or Greg or any of our community staff members, because even though it is very hard in this day and age of not seeing a lot of friends, a lot of relatives, because of restrictions going on with everything in our world right now, please just ask us questions and we will gladly be there, because I too know what it's like, because I suffer from anxiety, and having all these capabilities are just destroying my insides. So I just wanted to tell you and to tell the people watching as well too, that you are not alone. And if you want to know what we would like to do, then you're always more than welcome to, contact me on Instagram. It's the same name as my YouTube channel. I'm also on Twitch, same name as well. Just, talk to me, ask me questions about music or video games or anything like that, because I want to help people like Greg and Richard Metal Fan, Metal Meltdown, and all the subscribers to brain forth together about this music, because we need more people like Greg and myself and everyone watching to spread positivity, ignore all bullshit, because we are music people and the music is what defines us. Not because we're metalheads, but because we're advocates and we're individuals. So please do not be hesitant to not be afraid to ask us anything. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Follow me on Instagram and Twitch. You guys are all awesome. Greg, thank you so much for having me once more. Absolute pleasure doing this with you, man. And I'm looking forward to do more collaborative videos. And who knows, maybe I'll do one for 2022.
That is just absolutely wonderful to hear from you, man. And it's just absolutely wonderful that anybody who likes me or what I do is just always there for me. And it's just with me outside of YouTube. Now that we're going a bit off topic in this video, I apologize, but outside of YouTube, since the aftermath of the first 7-ish months, I've been improving myself, and I'm mentally and physically in a much better state. And I'm just like me being at my best in quite a long while. And like Jake said, guys, please do not doubt yourself for being who you are, and don't hesitate at all to message to your loved ones, friends and family, and contact us if any of you who would like to be involved with some interaction. And you just need to have the best love and care in the world. Anyways, guys, so that is it. And thank you guys so much for sticking around with me, and as well as giving Jake a lot of support and dedication to support SeditionThroughScorns for those that do follow his work. And we will be making another collaborative video again, hopefully very, very soon or later during the new year of 22. There will be some more collaborative videos coming along the way, and maybe some new special guests, because I have one coming up. Hopefully that will be posted before or after the new year, pops up in the world. So anyways, guys, peace and love. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.